Hi, my name's Tony Chapman. I'm the host of Chatter That Matters. In this age of noise, I cut through the chaos and confusion to focus on what matters most to your life and your livelihood. And on this episode, I chat with... Early August, looking at my news feed, something pops up from the Rolling Stone. The title is How COVID-19 Signals the End of the American Era. It's a picture, it's an American flag in tatters. And the caption says, the COVID crisis has reduced to tatters the idea of American exceptionalism. The author, Wade Davis, Canadian, cultural anthropologist, spent his life working with indigenous cultures, especially in North and South America. He studies the traditional use and beliefs associated with psychoactive plants. To National Geographic Explorer in Residence, Professional Anthropology, BC Leadership Chair, Cultures and Ecosystems at the University of BC, and author Wade Davis, welcome to Chatter That Matters. Anthropology is a word that everybody's fascinated about. How would you describe what an anthropologist does, and why does it matter to a society that's moving to the future?
Anthropology is not about the past. It's really about the future. It's about what kind of world do we want to live in. Franz Boas's great student Ruth Benedict, who said the purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for human differences. The lesson of anthropology is that every culture has something to say. Each deserves to be heard. None has a monopoly on the route to the divine. You know, the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts of being us. Each culture, by definition, is a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when they answer that question, they do so in the 7,000 different voices of humanity.
All over the world, I'm seeing either fought with bullets or ballots. It seems to be an even greater power grab. It seems like those in power with their hand on the rudder want to grip onto that very tightly. And is that just the state of the world today? Is that media that's causing me to have that perception and prejudice?
I think you're right, Tony. Empires rarely anticipate the demise, even though by definition, kingdoms are born to die. 15th century, I know, belonged to the Portuguese, the 16th to the Spanish, the 17th to the Dutch, the 18th to the French, the 19th to the British. It's kind of a stunning fact that the British Empire reached its greatest geographical extent with more of the world painted red than ever before as late as 1935. But we now know, of course, that the empire was gone. It was bled white and bankrupt by the Great War. And similarly, you know, America certainly had its time. But the question is, will America be granted a second century, or has the hinge of history, for better or for worse, moved towards Asia?
If you could argue in the States that even with the Civil War, there's always been this great divide. You know, Reagan, who's considered one of the great presidents, probably put civil rights back a decade in his first term. So it's always been this war between, you know, the American dream and how Hollywood presents it.
Of course, America's always been the best of all things and the worst of all things. It has also come together in ways that have literally saved civilization, such as in the industrial buildup of the Second World War, where essentially a demilitarized country with a smaller army than Portugal or Bulgaria in 1940, within 3 years had 18 million people serving in uniform, and literally with industrial might that transformed the world. The Ford Motor Company in World War II produced more industrial output than the nation of Italy. For every 4 pounds of equipment that the Japanese per capita got to a frontline troop, how many pounds did the Americans get to a soldier in World War II?
10 pounds?
Try a couple more numbers.
1,000 pounds.
2 tons. For
Wow.
every 5 pounds the Japanese got to a soldier, we got 2 tons across 13,000 kilometers of water. But the point is, out of that war came a country that dominated the world. That affluence allowed for a truce between labor and capital, that it wasn't a perfect world, but it was a world in which, you know, marginal tax rates on the wealthy were 90%. Of course, they didn't pay 90%, but the symbol was there that if you make millions, you're going to pay. The average CEO had a wage maybe 20 times that of a staff salaried individual in the company. Now, as you well know, that's just gotten out of control.
Why did that happen, Wade? I mean, you're talking about the great American dream, jobs, energy, swagger.
In a nutshell, Tony, it was globalization. Trade brings peace. There's no question about that. An integrated world. The vision that came out of World War II, you know, created a mandate for an interconnected, globalized economy dominated by the security of the American dollar. Globalization, the reality is it's a fancy term for capital on the prowl in search of cheap labor. And every working man and woman recognizes that. Going back to after World War II, I mean, you know, it was that truce between capital and labor that made the middle class. A working man with limited education could support a family, buy a house, buy a car, and send the kids to good public schools. And the whole issue in the States, and that's why in this Rolling Stone piece, I emphasize the fact that no matter what happens in November, you know that Trump, because of who he is, will continue to fuel the fires of division. But fundamentally, it doesn't matter who wins until America finds a way to return and restore a collective sense of community, a collective sense of fairness. You know, Trump is not a cause of any decline, but a symptom of this descent. I mean, the real tragedy of this cult of the individual in the United States, which denies the very concept of society or community. And the evidence of that is the very fact that 62 million people in 2016 went to the polls and voted not for the fate of the country. They voted their indignation, their hatred, their fears. They're not stupid. They knew that in voting for Donald Trump, his only credential was his willingness to validate their hatred, give voice to their anger, and target their enemies, real and imagined. And to me, that was an ultimate sign of, in a sense, the decadence of contemporary America.
So I want to read something you wrote in this article. Never in our lives have we experienced such a global phenomenon. For the first time in the history of the world, all of humanity, informed by the unprecedented reach of digital technology, has come together, focused on the same existential threat, consumed by the same fears and uncertainties, eagerly anticipating the same and yet unrealized promise of medical science. But in a single season, civilization has been brought low by a microscopic parasite 10,000 times smaller than a grain of salt. COVID-19 attacks our physical bodies, but also the cultural foundations of our lives. The toolbox of community and connectivity is for the human what claws and teeth represent to the tiger. My friend, those are powerful, powerful words. What was the observations and motivation that kind of led you to what you consider COVID-19 essentially being the tipping point to where America stands today?
It's interesting, Tony, you know, obviously pandemics have come in the past and they can have real impacts. For example, obviously the Black Death in the 14th century that brought down the entire medieval structure that had lasted for 1,000 years. In the case of COVID, the reality is that, you know, with 2,000 Americans dying a day, an American dying every minute of every hour of every day, the Americans woke up to realize, to their horror, that they were living in a failed state dominated by an absolutely dysfunctional government, led by an individual who was flaunting the use of disinfectants as a treatment for a disease that intellectually he did not begin to have the capacity to understand. At the same time, it revealed the hollowness of the American myth of exceptionalism, and the fact that when Americans, you know, sadly look in the mirror, they're bizarrely incapable of seeing what's actually become of the country. America has gotten to the point where it defines freedom as an individual's right to own a personal arsenal of weaponry, a freedom that trumps even the safety of their own children. 346 kids have been killed in schools by guns in this last few years alone. So what is it that's become of America? The problem is twofold. The cult of the individual, which has completely swept away all notions of community, even the very notion of society. The ethos is now that nobody owes anything to anybody. Everybody must fight for everything. And I try to point out what that implies by using an allegory from Canada. You can say whatever you want about our healthcare system, and we all have our challenges with it, but that's because we make a choice. We make a choice to service the collective needs of the people as opposed to the health needs of the individual, let alone the interests of the private investor who views every hospital bed as a rental property. Yes, if you have an elective procedure, you may have to wait a while, but if you have an emergency procedure, you won't. And when there's a crisis that affects us all, we're ready. Startling statistic that on July 30th, on a day that the Americans announced just shy of 60,000 new cases of COVID, in all the hospitals of British Columbia, there were only 5 COVID patients. So something's working here. And what people don't understand in the States is that, say, universal health care is not, again, about medicine. It's about social solidarity. It's about fairness. It's about sending a message to people that they count.